is actually one of the most famous ethnographies, most famous ethnographic books ever written. And this passage from the Nuer on page 132 is talking about how they had this ideal of autonomy. Evans-Pritchard says that every Nuer considers himself as good as his neighbor is evident in their every movement. They strut about like lords of the earth, which indeed they consider themselves to be. There is no master and no servant in their society, but only equals who regard themselves as God's noblest creation. Now, on the one hand, they say here that there has been a little bit, there has been a substantial feminist critique of Evans-Pritchard and this idea that everyone was an equal. Later authors would go back and examine some of this material. They kind of cite these sources, but they say that still in these societies, women had substantial freedom. There may have been some inequalities in terms of marriage patterns, but a lot of the women weren't married anyway, or had these interesting marriage arrangements. So it wasn't such a big deal, and that, you know, the Nuer should be still seen as at least an example of a pretty autonomous or a pretty egalitarian society. And so they say that the question is not necessarily, as we've been talking about, when various chiefs and kings and queens appear, people who have authority, but when it becomes impossible to disobey them. So it's not so much if the people have formal authority over each other, but when you can't leave anymore. When Cyrus gets up to leave and I make him sit down and I say, if you don't, something terrible is going to happen to you. You're going to be imprisoned here. It's not just your choice to stay here. So that's what they say is the criteria we want to think about when we're thinking about free and equal societies. Now, one of the issues is that maybe in other societies I'm free to travel, but it's a terrible form of travel. What if I like having stuff? I like my material surplus. I like to have my laptop and my phone and my passport, and I like to be able to fly places, not just walk from place to place. I want to drive. I want to be able to have that stuff, that freedom, those ideas that come to me from having all the stuff that I want. Now, this goes back to something that they talk about on page 133 about the ideas that we saw from Turgot, but actually for us most manifested in the ideas of Adam Smith, this book that we've been talking about, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, same year as the American Revolution, which talked to us about the invisible hand, the organization of the economy. And basically what they were saying, or they started to come up with the idea that material wealth, the surplus, the industry, and the commerce of a society would be the measure of a civilization. That the more stuff you had, the more better off you were. And so they were especially looking at the idea, well, before we go into that, I did want to chase one of their endnotes here. They usually don't chase an endnote in their book, but what they're saying is that Smith and Turgot wanted to make work and industry the standard of how you would judge various societies. And they said that by this standard, they could make European societies come out on top. If you look at it's an interesting endnote here. It comes up, it's endnote number 16. It goes to page 548 in the book, where you chase the endnote and it reads, "It must be recalled in this context that Turgot was writing in the mid-18th century, so most of the criteria we use nowadays to justify the superiority of Western civilization, a concept that did not exist at the time, clearly would not apply. what they're saying is that when Turgot and Adam Smith are first having these ideas that we should judge people by how much stuff they had, the idea of a Western civilization and the various ways in which we could prove superiority would not have applied. European standards of hygiene and public health, for example, were appalling, much worse than prevailed amongst, quote, primitive peoples of the time. So at the time of Turgot and Adam Smith, there was terrible hygiene in Europe. Europe had no democratic institutions to appeal to. Its legal systems were barbaric by world standards. Europeans were still imprisoning heretics and burning witches, something which happened almost nowhere else. Standards of living and even de facto wage levels were lower than in India or China or under the Ottoman Empire or Safavid Persia until perhaps the 1830s. So again, what they're saying is, by the standards of the time, the Europeans would have compared less well to other societies, but they could rescue it by saying that material wealth was the measure of things. And they believed that the more stuff you had, the more wealth, that then you would become free from having to work, from toil. And by that standard, it meant that even if people were working 14, 16 hours a day in the new mills and the new industries, they must be better off than people in the olden days, in those Stone Age hunters. And again, the idea here is that being commercial or being industrial is the same thing as being affluent. And again, Smith's book is called The Wealth of Nations, and talking about the differentials in wealth between different societies and justifying that we should have a market, basically capitalist economy, because it would make us more wealthy. Matt, you were interested in this idea, being able to have more stuff so you could be free from toil. That work? Yeah.
I think it was very interesting because the rule was the modern era.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to think that having this was such an advancement. You think about how much you can do how little we have to work now. You know, not having to wash things by hand, not having to constantly gather berries and fruits.
That's what you would think. Yeah. How many credits are you taking this semester, Cyrus? 24 credits. You thought yours was the worst? How many credits are you taking? 20. Yeah. All right, let's just go with 20. 20 is pretty bad, because if you're taking 20 credits, it means you have to be in a classroom for 20 hours a week. And it also means, at least according to Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Credit Hour, that you should be doing 2 hours of work for each hour that you're in class. So that would mean that you would be doing 40 hours of work outside of class for the 20 hours in which you're in class. I don't think we always do this. I try hard to hit that by giving you long reading assignments, big papers to write. But we don't always hit that, I'm afraid. But if we did, that would be a 60-hour work week. That sound fun? Sound fun. Sounds like a lot more work than they used to do in the past. There were people who objected to this. They quote on page 134, a very famous quote from John Stuart Mill, who back in 1848 said that all the labor-saving machinery that has hitherto been invented has not lessened the toil of a single human being, which is probably an exaggeration. I'm sure some people have benefited from this, but the problem is that every time something is invented, people use it to increase productivity. I think about the circular saw. grandfather called the skill saw. He loved the skill saw. He loved skill saws, electric razors. Thought they all helped him out. And he told me a story about how he used to be working carpentry. He was working in this, and there were people whose main job it was to saw the boards by hand. And they got really good at it. There's this one guy, he was like the designated saw guy, and he would just rip through that board. And when the skill saw came out that you could plug in and just go bzzz, like that, and it would go spin the blade, this is the old style one. He said, I can beat that thing. And he actually, my grandfather said there was a competition between the guy with the skill saw and the guy who just was good at cutting boards. And eventually the skill saw won, just was able to cut through the boards. The guy was pretty good, but he couldn't beat the skill saw, tired out. Grandfather could just keep going. Now, what do you think happened? Do you think that they said, aha, we got this skill saw now. I only have to work 4 hours a day. No. What happened? Double the production, right? Now we can build twice as much as we had before. We're really going to build some stuff. And then what do you think happened to that poor guy, the guy who built up all the saw skills? Yeah, now I can do it too. All those skills, I don't even pay him anymore. I might even have to get rid of that guy. I just got somebody else, get a robot to do it, right? So, the thing is what happens to that guy? He has to go get a different job, has to go back to school, retrain, got to take 20 credit hours and get a degree. He used to have some skills. The computer, that saves a lot of time, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we have less work in the sense of our needs. A lot of things are more rushed.
I mean, those web comments that make you do? Like when I was a kid, we wrote it out on a piece of paper. Come in, we'd hand it in. Next week, we'd get it back. It was like, you couldn't do it every class. Had to wait. Be patient. Couldn't do as much work. Computer saves time. Not really. Then I just make more assignments. Washing clothes. It is true. I do love the clothes washer. Love throwing them in there, pushing a button. Live it. However, in the old days, I didn't care if my clothes were that clean. Didn't need to wash them that much. Now I'm using that machine all the time. Grandfather, in the olden days when he was in Italy, only bathed 3 times a year. Talk about a time saver. Only had to bathe for Christmas, Easter, and that holiday when festival came into town. Saved all that time. Didn't have to take a bath every day. Terrible. Anybody think of something that has really saved time? Huh? Invent something else. There might be. I mean, it might be getting there, but I don't know. Yeah. Currency. Yeah.
I guess you still have to.
Still have to work for money so I can get the stuff that I want. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just interesting. Let me just put it to you this way. When anybody ever comes up and says, oh yeah, this is going to save you a lot of time, I get really nervous. What are you gonna make me do now, man? Now that you've saved me some time, you're gonna be like, oh, I just saved you some time. Now I'll make you do this other thing. Haven't decreased the work week yet. Some people are trying though. I've heard that the Brits just came up with a 4-day work week experiment, which they seem to be, some of them seem relatively enthusiastic about. So maybe it'll work. Who knows? All right. Time to talk about the original Affluent Society, an essay by Marshall Sahlins, which had its appeared in various forms in different places. Today, in today's world, it's been reprinted in a books that was, I think, published in 1972 called Stone Age Economics. It's one of the essays. Graeber and Wengrow says it's probably the most influential anthropological essay ever written, which means you probably should have heard of it, right, Cyrus? You hear about this essay? No, yeah, no. It's still crazy, though. It's still nuts. It's still mind-blowing. Why? Why did it blow your mind? Why were you surprised? Modern people are much poorer than hunter-gatherers. So the original wealthy, rich, affluent society, says Marshall Sahlins, were the hunter-gatherers. And what he was saying, and this was 1968, so keep that in mind. Boy, that's a long time ago. What he was saying is that wealth is measured in two different ways, right? You can be rich because of all the things you have, but there's also all the things I still want. I don't have the latest iPhone. And so the denominator just keeps getting bigger. The denominator and the numerator, right? And so the things I want just keeps increasing and the things I have is small. Whereas if you reduce the things I need, then I become rich just because I don't need it. They're easily satisfied. Now, Marshall Sahlins, it turns out, was hanging out in France over with Levi-Strauss. And he was having lunch every day with that guy who wrote Society Against the State, that anarchist, Pierre Clastres. And in 1968, there's a student worker revolution in France, which Levi-Strauss got really mad about because they were messing up the streets and stuff. But Sahlins and Clastres were way into it. They were more interested in this way to transform society, and that sort of had a lot to do with the context of this essay. So, the prevalent idea at the time, some of you have said already, is that hunter-gatherers were constantly trying to get stuff. They had to work all the time to hunt and gather and do all their stuff. And the time, this was in a quote from 1957, I think from an anthropologist or archaeologist, Robert Braidwood said, "A man who spends his whole life following animals just to kill them to eat, or moving from one berry patch to another, is really living just like an animal himself." So the idea is that these people as hunters or gatherers were the same as the animals in the wild. They had not improved their condition, and that, they had to work all the time, just like the animals, for their subsistence. Now, when they actually measured the amount of time that people in these societies were doing something like we would consider to be work, they found out that, in fact, you could do all the work required in like 2 to 4 hours a day. It's like taking 2 credits instead of 20. It was relatively easy, and then you had more time for singing and dancing, hallucinogenics, whatever you wanted to do. Hanging out. Yeah.
I didn't write this in my comments.
Sure.
What does it count to work?
What does it count to work? That is a good question, right? I mean, and it was always like they were trying to measure. Came to us mostly from Richard Lee's studies in the Kalahari. He was trying to measure, okay, here's what they need to survive to get your food and your shelter. How long does it take to provide those things? But you're right. What does it mean to work? And what do you even consider to be work in a certain society, right? And so, and are you measuring, for example, women's work and men's work the same? So there have been questions raised about it. It's a great question. And, like I said, it was simply a calculation of here's what I need to get my subsistence, what I need to have in society. Now, some of that had to do with these wonderful things, which Liz, already, perhaps clued in from a different class you're taking what these are. What are these? Mongongo nuts. Mongongo nuts. These things are abundant in the Kalahari, very nutritious. You don't have to sow them. You don't have to do much to them. They just grow. They're yummy. And as one person from the Kung put it, why should we plant when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? Why do I want to put all this wheat and barley and rye in the ground and have to work it when I can just go out and get all these mongongo nuts? Or even better, somebody else can get them for me, come back and give them to me. Yummy. Liz, why were you drawn to this? Because of the other class. In the other class, they also mentioned these mongongo nuts. They seem to be all over the place. They're really only in the Kalahari, I think. I don't think we have mongongo nuts here, I'm pretty sure. I think we might have to order some and try them out for ourselves. But it's really interesting to me how often the mongongo nuts get used. I think my own feeling is that this quote was originally what Richard Lee got from someone in the Kalahari. And I have thought that when Jared Diamond used the same quote for his worst mistake in the history of the human race, he acted like he had gotten the quote himself, but he stole it from Richard Lee. I'm starting to wonder, though, where this quote originally came from. I would really like to find the person who said this. That person should get like super credit. They should be cited. That person should be like, they should get like social media likes for this. They deserve more credit than they got for this. So, it would be an interesting, if it's been, Graeber and Wengrow says it's been cited ever since in 1,000 treatises, 1,000 documents on the origins of farming. It would be interesting to trace this back to whoever said it. Who was the first one to say this? Where did they actually get it from? I'd write a whole paper on that. I'd love to know that. All right, so there are so many mongongo nuts in the world, no reason to plant. Felicia, does that mean that they are just leisurely leaning around all those hunter-gatherers, just being lazy and not working and eating mongo? No, why not? Be leisurely. So they make the point that, that not all, that doesn't mean that everybody valued leisure and dancing or, again, Cyrus, you're absolutely right. What is work? Is it work to produce art? So the Kwakiutl produced many things. And Levi-Strauss apparently said once that it was like there were a dozen different Picassos all working at the same time in this one little society because of the amazing production of art. Is producing art work? That's a good question. Is it work to produce a ceremonial mask? Is it work to produce a sculpture? I don't need it. I mean, it's an interesting question. Anyway, the point of the matter is that many people were not necessarily leisurely. And in fact, the people that Richard Lee were studying may have just been, they were hunters and gatherers or foragers in Africa. So maybe, what would you say, Felicia? they must have represented the original state. Human beings. What was the original state? Was it more leisurely or was it more working? There was no original state. That's their claim. That we have people that may have been leisurely, people that may have been working. There's not one state that you can say it all was like the Hadza or it all was like the Kwakiutl. So the way I thought about this is that there are actually lots of ways, different ways to be free or have different freedoms and be wealthy. And there are lots of different ways in which societies can make themselves equal. Of course, I guess they also don't say, or they don't necessarily dwell on this, but I thought it was worth thinking about that there are lots of ways to be oppressed too, right? There are lots of ways in which people try to control each other or try to create inequalities or try to, there's lots of different ways to be poor. So that's true as well. What they're saying is there's not an original one, and that all of these things people have experimented over time with different kinds of societies, and that some societies even changed because of the seasons. One season they're very hierarchical, the next season they're very egalitarian, and these would alternate. And so their question is, which we've seen, is how did we get stuck in our current condition? How did things become, not just how did things become so unequal, but why can't we even imagine a more equal society? Why can't we even imagine a more free society? Why can't we imagine being able to change our identity from one season to the other? Why has that become so difficult to imagine? So they say that to answer that question, we're going to go out of the Ice Age. So we've seen this variation in the Ice Age in those wonderful burials and those hunter and gather monuments and different things in the Ice Age. And we're now going into that warmer period that is called the Holocene. We're going to go and look at some hunting and gathering societies in Japan and what is now Louisiana, Mississippi, the Caribbean coast of North America.